Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on what we can do to advance towards smart cities by making transportation more accessible and inclusive. I'm Nino Di Cara, founder of Electric Autonomy Canada, and I'm delighted to introduce today's discussion, which is sponsored by AutoCrypt. AutoCrypt is a mobility cybersecurity provider dedicated to the safety of new transportation. Its solutions secure the rapidly evolving framework of smart mobility from start to finish, including EV charging, autonomy, and a fleet management system designed for mobility services and platforms that ensure the secure and efficient operation of fleets. AutoCrypt's proprietary technology utilizes real-time data communication to ensure that mobility service operators can provide safe and optimized services to their customers. Well, onto the webinar. We know that conscientious planning is required to ensure inclusivity for people with limited mobility or mobility challenges, such as expectant and new mothers and disability users, such as wheelchair users, and that these users stand to benefit alongside the broader community. In this discussion, we explore how connected, intelligent, and inclusive transportation can benefit these communities, and how safely and securely managed data can help cities become smarter and avoid marginalization. Before introducing you to the panel, some quick housekeeping. If you have questions, please add them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. And if you're making general comments on the conversation and not asking a specific question, please, if I could ask you to please put those into the chat section. Right, well, let's meet our panel. They are Andrew Gregory, Manager, Transit Planning, City of Edmonton. Igor Smarzik of S&G Urban Partners and former chair of the Advisory Committee on Accessible Transit, Toronto Transit Commission. Joel Denby, Paralympian, public speaker and advocate for accessibility and inclusion. Jason Yu, Chief Strategy Officer of AutoCrypt. And my colleague, Emma Jarrett, Managing Editor, Electric Autonomy Canada, who will be moderating the discussion. And I'm pleased to pass over to Emma right now. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Nino. Welcome to our panel. Really great to have everybody here. And before we jump into our discussion, it would be great to get to know all of you a little bit better and let you introduce yourselves to our listeners. So Jason, could you just give us 1 to 2 lines on your background, and we will go around in a circle from who I see on my screen after that.
Oh, thanks for putting this event together. It's a pleasure. Thank you to Electric Autonomy Canada for putting this event together, and thank you for the other panelists for joining. I've been in the cybersecurity industry since about 2011. It's certainly changed a lot over the years, but I'm very excited to talk today, not necessarily about cybersecurity, but how to use the resulting data from all of the communications in a safe way, which I suppose is cybersecurity as well. So delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. Joel, you're next.
Thanks, Emma. I'm Joel Denby. I'm a former Canadian Paralympian. I played wheelchair tennis for a number of years, representing Canada on the international stage. Should also mention that I've been in a wheelchair for more than 30 years and have lived in many of Canadian cities and have traveled abroad. And so accessible transportation is super important to me. And that's why I'm really excited to be part of today's panel.
Thanks. Igor, you're next.
Thanks, Emma. My name is Igor. I'm a disabled urban planner. I do a lot of work within the nonprofit, municipal and volunteer sector to support accessible public spaces on a variety of different sort of topics and issues. So thank you all for having me.
And last but not least, Andrew. I think you're on mute, Andrew.
Thank you, Emma. I'm Andrew Gregory, Manager of Planning with Edmonton Transit. We recently introduced a new bus network last year that's more efficient and help get across the city better. and also implemented a new on-demand service network that helps make transit more accessible and being able to provide more equitable service across the city.
Great. So to kick us off on our discussion today, I thought, Jason, we could start with you and you could give us a lay of the land from your perspective. What really are the range of problems that can be solved with accessible and or on-demand transit? And part two is, what are companies like your company, like AutoCrypt, doing to solve these issues?
Sure, thank you. Well, let's highlight some of the problems we're seeing now and some that we are predicting for the future. 2021, England's Department of Transport stated that in 2019, adults with disabilities made 26% fewer trips and traveled 41% fewer miles than adults without disabilities. Added to that, according to the American Association of People with Disabilities, 28% of those living with disabilities rarely leave their home. And the future, based on these projections, is not great, because by 2050, 68% of the world's population is expected to live in urban communities. Of those people, roughly 15% will be people with disabilities. That's an astounding number of 937 million people, almost 1 billion people with disabilities who will be living in urban areas, which also does not take into account people with other mobility challenges, like expecting parents, recent parents, the elderly, et cetera. So what does all this mean? It's safe to say that the number of those struggling with mobility will be far too large if we keep the infrastructure just as it is now. It's also worth mentioning that the smart cities of the future has to include accessibility and inclusivity. The famous transport consultant, Walter G. Hansen, defined accessibility as the opportunity which an individual or type of person at given location possesses to take part in a particular activity or set of activities. So the participation part is really key for us. So, a smart city's very essence and development is dependent not only on the infrastructure that it can provide, but how rich the data, how rich the participation is on the residents to contribute and continue to contribute to the service. So when we think of barrier-free infrastructure, it needs to become a part of policy development. So moving on to solutions, there may not be a cure-all for barriers establishing a smart city right now, but there are some short and long-term solutions to ensure that mobility can become more accessible and inclusive. In the short term, we believe that utilizing fleet management solutions allows for increasing the optimal operations of these mobility services, especially when you're using artificial intelligence and machine learning and technologies like that. And the point is to reduce human error for passengers, drivers, and service providers. And what does this do? It increases the sense of reliability for service users. And this is the key to increase the probability for participation in any smart city. So finally, to wrap up, what have we done? We've developed a fleet management solutions system, and we have some case studies that are really exciting that we want to be able to share with you. The first is the 2U access demand responsive transport that we did. And this was a partnership with a nonprofit called 2U Cooperative in Busan, which is the second largest city in South Korea, with a population of 3.4 million. And the goal was to provide an affordable, convenient taxi fleet specifically designed to serve residents who face mobility challenges, including those with physical disabilities, the elderly, pregnant parents, or those who are left out of mainstream transportation in general. The feedback that we've gotten on this between July of 2020 and June of 2022, we've gathered over 16,000 users, over 160,000 rides, and recorded a 85% satisfaction rate and a 95% reuse intention rate. This program has been so successful that it's expanded to 30 other cities in South Korea, in Busan and one of the largest provinces south of Seoul, which is considered kind of the suburb of Seoul. We've done a similar thing for expecting parents and recent parents in a project called iMom Taxi. And this is also a DRT service with a focus on pregnant parents and families with infants. It's really interesting. Car seats are for kids are required by law, but many services fail to follow through on it because they're bulky and they need to be able to store these in compact sedans. So the local governments wanted to design an on-demand taxi service with a simple registration booking service. Between September of 2020 and June of 2022, this has been running. We've had over 4,000 users, over 25,000 total rides, and a 92.1% satisfaction rate. This is being expanded as well to cover other hospitals. And I think it really shows that once you have a good DRT or out there, the people will really enjoy them and use them continually. And we're providing a service that's desperately needed for people who want to participate and be more mobile in spite of the challenges that they face.
Thanks. So Igor, I thought from an urban designing or urban planning perspective, you could expand a little bit on how, the importance of accessible, equitable, and efficient transit is, just in terms of how a city functions, but also diving a bit deeper onto what Jason just talked about with all the data that's collected and how that can help inform an even better transit system going forward, make it a more like fluid and mobile thing rather than a stagnant monolith.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a really important intersection between technology and accessibility. And cities have, unfortunately for people with disabilities, they've been designed in a way that sort of discriminates against us. And I think there's an important opportunity here to sort of leverage technology to improve the way that people with disabilities can participate in society. So I'll give an example of what that sort of looks like that hopefully answers your question, which is something that we can all relate to. Where you live in an urban setting or a city is really determined by like what you can afford, one of the factors, and that determines sort of the services and resources that you have access to in those areas. So if you live in areas of the city that lack rapid transit options, your commute obviously takes longer to access those services, which tend to be focused or located within the core of cities, for example. So by using sort of technology and data collection, my opinion, you can sort of identify different opportunities where seniors, people with disabilities, where they live, and use that data to sort of inform not only sort of transit options, so things like increasing different frequencies based on where people live, but also sort of more specialized services that can be offered by municipalities or other service providers. And then this also extends to sort of like land use and economic development patterns as well, where this data can be used to inform those decisions that are made as well, so that the most amount of people can benefit, especially folks who are sort of left outside of the conversation when it comes to their participation in society. So it's really fascinating. I think data can be used in sort of, if it's used in the correct way, safely and sort of securely, it can be a really powerful tool to better integrate the needs of people with disabilities into our society.
Thanks. And Andrew, does any of this resonate with you in terms of the problems and benefits we just heard from Jason and Igor, and your experience with launching the Edmonton Transit answer to on-demand accessible transportation?
Yes, absolutely, Emma. And last year, we unveiled two big projects for transit. We implemented an entire new bus network, which has faster, more frequent routes and service during more time span periods. So providing more flexibility for when you want to use transit. While in our older network, routes were more convoluted, slower, and some areas had peak hour service or no service at all. The trade-offs to get there is that some customers experience longer walking distance going from 400 to 600 meters. So we definitely heard there were gaps. And so we implemented on-demand service to help address those longer walking distances. Our on-demand service is one of the largest in North America with 56 buses running from day one. So there are basically three customer sets that we wanted to help with launching the on-demand service. One group was neighborhoods that lost service or was right at the cusp or just beyond 600 meters that wanted to improve connectivity and maintain those same connections to nearby frequent routes or transit centers. Another group was areas that were growing that weren't served before to provide connections to the regular network, and that could be upgraded to regular routes as ridership picks up. And the third group is seniors residences or major hubs to really minimize walking distance and provide seniors the opportunity and flexibility to still go around their lives without facing barriers. Overall, we've heard a lot of feedback from our customers. We want to help address some barriers, especially for expecting mothers, young parents, anybody with limited mobility, and seniors who might not have the same opportunity to get around and walk further compared to most of the population. Since the launch of the new network and on-demand service April last year, we've made over 70 changes and adjustments and improvements based on public feedback. And we have more on the way this summer and fall. So this is an ongoing improvement. Our on-demand service is a 2-year pilot, which will probably change or improve slightly more next spring. So we're definitely always open to feedback and adjust what we can with the resources available.
Yeah, I think that the feedback creating, a dynamic improvement loop is really neat. I mean, can you give us an example of anything that you remember coming up as, this is an issue from a user point of view, and then the change it might have inspired?
Yes, so there were a few areas where we made changes to a regular bus route where one of the busier corridors, we had 2 routes operating. And then there was an area where there wasn't much development, but a school and a major religious cultural hub. So after implementation of the new network, we did receive a few requests. We took a look at what type of adjustments can be made. We made the route change. We're still in the middle of putting in a couple more bus stops as this change was made in the winter. So looking at improving accessibility further this year. So that was on the regular bus route side, and on the on-demand service side, as areas grew, we added additional bus stop. We've added additional destinations where in some cases you might only have one destination and in some cases 2. So we're able to provide more destinations to reduce backtracking and save travel time. Also, we've added some perimeter stops. So if you're traveling to the nearest transit hub, rail station, or transit station, the on-demand service was initially meant to get you there as fast as possible. But if you're trying to get to a nearby shopping center or school, that might not be that convenient. So we've added additional transfer opportunities to help people get to where they need.
Great. And Joel, what's running through your mind as you're listening to all of this? Both as an advocate and as a transit user with a disability.
Well, it's very exciting, and I've seen sort of the progression of accessible technologies as it relates to, things like wheelchairs, things like on-demand services through your mobile phone that do benefit people with disabilities. But in many ways, transportation is that one threshold that we need to get right, especially as Canada and around the world, we're growing our cities and we're making our cities more inclusive. And when I look at many of the economic opportunities, across Canada, especially, many people with disabilities don't have access to the same way to get to work, to visit a small business, or even more importantly, access healthcare, which is going to be a bigger issue moving forward just because of our aging population in Canada. And, living through an era where, accessibility is getting more notice, and using these technologies, it's a net good. And so it's so exciting to see what's happening in Edmonton, and I'm thrilled, and I can't wait to be part of it moving forward.
And Joel, I mean, when you compare like then and now, were there times in the past where you have had an incident, or know someone who had an incident or difficulty accessing transit, that did try to convey that to the appropriate transit authority and hit a roadblock? Or maybe the opposite happened, maybe it actually affected some positive change?
Yeah, I mean, when you are in a wheelchair, or you have a physical disability, having a routine, having a habit is so important. And in many ways, many of the circumstances that I experienced when I was using transit were very reactive in the moment. And I was, I tell the story often of heading to Union Station and then getting off at Union Station in Toronto, and the elevator's not working at all, and me not having a recourse. But the ability for me to sort of plan out my transportation on demand in the moment, because life doesn't quite work like like most people. When you have a disability, you might need a different way to get to work. You might need to leave work early to visit another meeting in another building. And I've had many frustrations getting in and around Toronto. So it is one of those things that I think if we work not around disability, but with disability in mind, it doesn't just benefit someone like me in a wheelchair, it benefits all of us. And I think that's what's so exciting.
I once struggled through Union Station with a baby stroller and a broken elevator. So I see that, and working, with all the different factors people bring into their transit experience and how it can benefit everyone. Andrew, just pinging back to you for a sec. Could you just talk a little bit how Edmund Transit even identified that a lack of on-demand transit was an issue in the city? Was it directly from customer feedback? Was it a study? How did that work?
Yes, it was both. We knew that there were gaps in the system and in the city that needed to be addressed. We also didn't want to compromise or slow down the rest of the bus network and go back to filling every gap and making it slow and inconvenient. And so in order to make most of the network as efficient as possible, while still being able to provide efficient service, especially in areas where ridership is lower, or you might not need as much service, the on-demand service model was the most cost-effective in terms of service delivery. Also running a big bus in an area where you only pick up a handful of people, you're using a lot more fuel or energy than you need to. So we're trying to all be more efficient with our resources and environmentally conscious. Years ago, when we were developing the bus network, we had no idea that we were going to operate on-demand service. It was just something we heard of. And the more we learned about it, the more we realized that this is probably the best service delivery model to cover these areas. So we're very excited that we were able to launch in such a big impact. Overall, most of the feedback we have received is positive. There are a few areas that we know there's opportunities for improvement. So we're looking into that a little more closely. But we're definitely going to continue to listen to our customers and adapt, especially when we can make some quick and easy changes.
Thanks. And in terms of other transit authorities who either are considering this currently or wanting to, but not knowing where to start, I mean, if you had to identify the first three things that you need to do in order to start crafting a pathway towards on-demand transit, what would they be?
First, to really understand what the customer's needs are, and especially are they traveling across the city more to a local hub? Would also like reach out to probably comparable or nearby transit agencies about best practices, seeing what's working well with different service delivery models, and also to be aware of like what type of resources or budget availability, whether you can do something in-house or reach out to another contractor. So a lot of it we learned as we're going along, and we're still learning. But overall, I'm very excited that we were able to launch this, and hopefully we can continue to grow the system.
Great. And speaking of questions on how to even begin with this, if anybody listening does have questions, do please put them in the chat so we see them and can ask them at the end. Jason, popping back to you. I mean, there is an accountability piece here with people's data and privacy. It's obviously being collected, and it's incredibly valuable and useful for the system when, you know, for that customer feedback component. But I think we can all appreciate that there is maybe some privacy concerns people have. How is my data being used, stored, protected? Can you speak to how that's all taken care of?
Yeah, absolutely. For our fleet management solutions, we want to ensure that all of the data that's uploaded and tracked are kept secure and private. I think shortly in the future, the OEMs or the vehicle providers themselves will integrate the software, which will the FMS, the fleet management data, will be shared as an integrated software solution in the vehicles themselves. But for right now, what we're working with is a short-term solution in the form of OBD2 dongles that can be extracted under the dashboard in order to collect the data. We also have to remember that it's just not the data from the vehicles themselves. They're being transported to the back-end infrastructure. So if we think of that as kind of a castle in the back that's handling all of these areas, that also needs to be well fortified. And as with anything, connections to the outside world must be so clearly defined from this castle, so that if anything deviates from what is considered legitimate use of the data is completely blocked and not allowed access to either the data or to the backend infra or to the vehicles itself. So speaking a little bit more about the OBD2 solution that we put in, it's a hardware solution, so it collects and utilizes data to ensure that the fleets are utilizing real-time data for reporting, customized analysis, big data modeling through machine learning. So we could do this through Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, or LTE connections to gather and transmit the data. With this data, the mass providers can enjoy optimized fleet management with service platforms, which means that they can run the businesses much more efficiently than ever before, and to be able to serve the customers' needs without expending too much of their own resources to run these businesses. So the two case studies that I mentioned, those aren't huge companies, and they're funded by local governments and nonprofits, and they want to run the leanest DRT service possible. And this kind of solution helps them run these kinds of things. So when we talk about the specific data that's being collected, it could be vehicle diagnosis, it could be drive pattern analysis, real-time tracking and dispatch, real-time log, data management on the blockchain, and driver passenger authentication. So there's a lot of data that's being sent back and forth. The idea is for us is to definitely not store the data in these dongles in the hardware units inside the vehicles. Send them directly back into the main server so that they could be processed and utilized in a safe way. We also want to encrypt all of the data that's being sent to the back end, so that if anybody was to try to steal it or anything like that, it would be completely useless, and it could only be decrypted by legitimate users, in this case, being in the backend infrastructure. So rather than playing defense, I think establishing a clear line of cybersecurity enabled best practice for handling all of the data will not only make it safer, obviously, for all of these DRT services, but you could actually increase the integrity of the data. In other words, you could trust all of the data with absoluteness that's being exchanged back and forth. And that would also help preserve the privacy concerns of all of this data being sent back and forth wirelessly from the vehicle to the backend infrastructure.
Thank you. So Igor, all of this, the data that's collected, the equity piece that comes in with, breaking open cities and built environments to people who have been marginalized, perhaps unintentionally, but because their experiences weren't factored in when the transit was being established. Long way of asking, what's the dream scenario for you with respect to how all of this integrates into and supports the environment going forward and by environment, I mean the built environment for everyone going forward? What does the ideal city of tomorrow look like for you?
Well, I definitely think it's a seamless system that allows folks to either book rides or access public transit just like everyone else, so that people with disabilities feel like they can access the system just as well as able-bodied folks. I think at the end of the day, one of the key words that I would stress is options. So currently, as Joel sort of referenced to as well, people with disabilities have limited options when it comes to the way that they travel through space. And I think we want to improve that so that so it's easier for folks to navigate the system. Oftentimes when you are sort of booking a specialized service, or the traditional way of booking a specialized service, it's quite a process. It takes a lot of time. You have to call in advance. There's certain specifications with regards to canceling certain things, doing it in advance in a certain amount of hours. Like, it's quite sort of taxing on folks to have to go about do all that, whereas able-bodied folks are able to choose from a number of different options, whether it's cycling or Uber, or if transit doesn't work, they can drive. Like, there's options at your disposal. So I think we want to sort of like elevate that seamless system so that people with disabilities can access it just like everyone else. And then the final thing I'll just say really quickly that I think is related to this is I would just stress that oftentimes as the quote unquote experts, like urban planners, designers, engineers, architects, we, create systems and we build these systems, and we think of them as sort of like perfect in some way because we put a lot of effort and there's a lot of sort of research and energy behind it. And sometimes I think we inadvertently, when things don't go right, we blame people in the way that they interact with those systems, that they're not using it the way that they're supposed to use it, or they don't know. And so I guess I would just sort of challenge us who are in like decision-making roles to sort of reflect critically and think about maybe it's not always the fault of the users, maybe the users, and I think this is where the data that Jason was talking to helps with this, the data and the users, maybe they're right in some of these situations around why certain things aren't working. And so I think we should sort of critically think about that and try to sort of challenge ourselves to think outside the box when it comes to the way we design systems, and to leverage those ideas from what users are telling us, and maybe fix some of those preconceived notions we have in terms of what we were taught, or what we learned in school about how we design a transit system. Maybe it looks like something very different than what we think it is today, and I think that's okay. So
yeah, I mean, it calls into question like a really interesting piece of this discussion, which is like data bias. And it matters who is not only giving feedback, but the people that are interpreting it as well. So, I mean, Joel, could you speak to that and how important it is to have people with disabilities or mobility challenges? And put my hand up for the mothers of young children out there, also being included in these discussions of, okay, we have this glut of data, we have this transit system, what do we do to make it better?
Yeah, I think, it's important not just to have people with disabilities to have a seat at the table, but to be active participants, especially at the embryonic phase of deploying this technology. And you can use so many examples across Canada, Canadian cities. I know one person in the chat has mentioned the inaccessibility of Montreal, and having trained there as a Paralympian, I can attest to that. And that's just one example of, a subway system. Obviously, we're not talking necessarily about subways today, but where disabilities weren't factored into those decisions all those years ago. And when you look at the costs of remaking an entire subway grid that are accessible, I mean, it's astronomical. And so when you consider disability first, when you cross that threshold, and this isn't something that is that, out of place. I mean, when you look at major technology companies like Apple, Microsoft, they tend to bring people with disabilities in first as users. So I think we do need to make sure that we bring in, accessibility advisory committees across Canadian cities, and obviously Edmonton has one, Toronto, all of them do, and make sure that they're a big part of that. And testing, you got to keep testing this. And I think the one thing that I think people forget about is accessibility is a moving line. So too is disability. What we thought of as a disability 20 years ago might not necessarily be a disability in the future, but that doesn't really matter. You have to keep, testing and making sure that all people with disabilities are included. And really that's the moving line of accessibility too. So this is a chance to get it right. And I'm happy to be a part of it.
And I mean, question for the group, as you just said, Joel, I mean, I would say in 90% of most of our conversations about transit authorities, we're talking about a system that already exists that we're having to retrofit. I mean, what added layer of challenge does that present rather than purpose building a transit system that, as you say, had accessibility and equity of access front and center from day one? I mean, Andrew, could you kick us off with that? Like, how big is that mountain to climb to retrofit something?
Yeah, you're right. There's definitely some older infrastructure that's not very accessible, and a lot of barriers or steps that, for most people might not be a big deal, but even, carrying a stroller, a small child, or wheelchair, or seniors, a few steps could be the difference between being able to take the system or not. And I'm looking at the question that was asked about Montreal here. We realize that some cities definitely are less accessible than others. One city and transit system that we have been really looking up to is Transit in Vancouver. They're probably one of the most thorough in their design guidelines. Definitely worth taking a look at to anybody who is not as familiar, but there's a big emphasis on making more open space, reducing some of the grades or any type of steep barriers to get on and on the system, wider access points, fewer pinch points. And so we've been taking a look and adapting some of those into our own design standards, especially when building new transit facilities. We've already reconstructed one of our older rail stations that had a lot of steps an old elevator that might have always been that reliable, narrow sight lines, not the safest and a bit dark, to fully add grade station. So that really helped improve service and accessibility in a more vulnerable area. One thing we can't do is retrofit some of the private property or areas that access transit. So that's something that often requires partnership with the private sector. And it might be not as simple to address, but what we can do is improve service accessibility and access on our transit facilities.
Great, and I'll just say what the question is, because we mentioned it twice now, and I'm not sure the audience can see the Q&A. So the question is, to Andrew, you, if your project involves interacting with representatives of public transport in other cities. I live in Montreal, and in 2014, Montreal was considered to be one of the most inaccessible cities in Canada for the physically disabled with regard to accessing public spaces. So I think you did answer that from your perspective. But Igor, I wanted to grab you and see, you know, if you had any comments on, you know, communication between transit authorities to learn best practices, to find out, you know, if something didn't work and why it didn't work, and how to, you know, not keep making the same mistakes between cities.
Well, I mean, I definitely think that, like, going off this whole notion of like a seamless transit system and a seamless sort of experience for people with disabilities, I think that extends exactly to what you sort of asked, which is the exchanging of information and knowledge transfer between different municipalities and levels of government. I mean, personally, I don't think it happens at the level that it's probably needed to share data in that way, so that, you know, different mistakes that were made don't happen again, and there's lessons learned. I think many times there's a siloing effect that exists where various departments or levels of government or regional sort of transit authorities versus local or municipal transit authorities have very different sort of standards of what is accessible and what isn't, and they exercise those standards for projects that they oversee, and therefore you get this sort of mismatch of accessibility across the country, which I think actually works against the, you know, the entire system, as people with disabilities sort of live everywhere and, you know, should be expected to sort of travel and go to different places within the country and within the world. And I think they should rightfully so expect a certain level of accessibility. So I definitely think it's a missed opportunity and something that I think needs to be worked on in terms of sharing that data and sort of coming together to come up with sort of consistent standards across the different sort of areas of the country, different levels of government, so that people know what to expect.
Yeah, I really like that, actually. Talking like, that's just a peace of mind that would give, where you know that, you know, the transit system in Vancouver is not going to give you radically different service than the transit system in Halifax, for example. That's a really interesting, like, psychological piece for people who use transit.
Just to chime in, yes, absolutely. And we obviously this summer we talk a lot about travel and exploring Canada. I mean, it's obviously airports are pretty backed up right now in Canada, Pearson. But it's almost like when you rely on accessible transportation, you have to relearn everything from the ground up, and you can almost waste away hours just trying to understand the best route to get from point A to point B. So I love that idea too, Emma.
Yeah, if I may chime in as well, I think we're taking a slightly different approach at AutoCrypt here in South Korea. We, of course, there has to be some level of retrofitting of the existing infrastructure, but I think we're kind of approaching it more towards really targeting the segments of the population that are currently underserved by the traditional transportation infrastructure, and giving them a solution or a service just for them. And as I mentioned before, that the feedback from these people that have disabilities, or, you know, expecting mothers, the elderly, are really really enthusiastic and really appreciate the the services that we're helping to provide for them. And ultimately, as Joel said earlier, it's not just a seat at the table. You know, they need to be able to participate, and we're seeing that the people that we're trying to serve with these programs appreciate it so much that the participation levels on the feedback side is just great. You know, one of the things working with the existing infrastructure, however, I think one of the interesting things that we've done is we did something called a 2U map, which is it utilizes a large pool of data to make a mapping service just for those who have accessibility issues. So if there's you know, steps, hills, curbs, wheelchair charging stations, accessible bathrooms, those are all kind of laid out, and that's been really great for them. And if something hasn't been detected yet by whatever we provide through the mapping service, it allows the users to be able to take a photo and pin and drop a pin and say that there's an accessibility issue here, and we're able to put together kind of routes and even tourism routes so that the community of users can share what is accessible in a city. So I think that's been really exciting as well, the participation component of all of this.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Audience, please keep sending questions. These are great discussions we're having. And you know, Jason, like that dropping the pin and saying like there's a problem here, or this is something that could be fixed, reminds me a lot of certainly what we have here with our EV charging app programs, where, you know, users can in real time say, oh, like this charger's down, or there's somebody not in an EV parked in the parking spot for the charger. Like, I think that real-time feedback loop it's very valuable, I think, for the companies, and also it makes users and customers feel like they're really being heard and paid attention to. So to all of you, I mean, you each interact with the government and the different levels of government with wearing different hats. Do you sense that now is the moment for, you know, governments saying like, we're building back better, and that each level is keen to reimagine public transportation service?
I can start here. You know, we have something called now the Accessible Canada Act, which was just passed a few years ago by our federal government, and ironically the first federal accessibility legislation in Canada. And when I look at the United States, for example, they've had something like that since 1990. What I would say is don't wait for the government. This is something where I actually see a tremendous economic opportunity by deploying this technology, and not just for people with disabilities. And one thing that I would say, and I guess I can say this because I'm not in the government, is that a lot of these accessibility legislations at either the provincial level or the federal level simply are not enough. And I think we need to go beyond waiting for proper legislation and simply do it. Obviously, there's a few things we have to pass at the municipal level, but you know, I've been around you know, a while now, and you know, I've seen something here in Ontario called the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and not a huge amount of movement when it comes to major accessibility changes. And I sense the same thing, sadly, with our federal legislation. So what I would say is, if ideas like this one and tremendous technologies do not need to necessarily wait for government. They obviously need to have some semblance of oversight, but I'm at the point where you know, let's just do it and work together.
So, I mean, Igor, what's your take on that? Because, you know, given your previous work with the TTC, is it realistic to move ahead without government support? I mean, is it even feasible?
I mean, I totally echo what Joel said and agree with him on every aspect. I think that I just think that we're in a moment in time where the technology sort of exists or is being developed, and there's companies and opportunities to expand that expand that technology. And I think that we need to do whatever we can, I think, to support those opportunities for people to create technologies that benefit people with disabilities. And I think that, not to sort of like harp on the government, like the government isn't doing stuff, they are, but I just think the nature of government and the system and some of the things that Joel was referencing with various legislation and whatnot, it takes a very long time. And so, I mean, I think it would be great if these companies that are doing this work could, team up or be, contracted out by sort of the large public sort of transit infrastructure organizations and can collaborate on some of these things. I think that's sort of what that looks like, to sort of leverage these external companies and what they've been able to do. And I think that's already starting to happen in various places, just based on the amount of data that's already been collected with some of this, these autonomous sort of vehicles that are going on and whatnot. So I think that that'll continue happening in the future. And I think that's sort of where the solution really lies. I think the market will sort of push everyone into a direction where folks work together, hopefully, and we can create these sort of societies that work better for everyone.
In our part of the world, I think we've worked with both. We've worked with nonprofit NGOs, and we've also worked with local governments. That was for the parent taxi service. My thought is, why can't, I think we could work with both. I think certain local governments have the initiative to be able to want to provide these sorts of demand response transport services. But also, the organizations like the nonprofit that we're working with, To Cooperative, they could be really effective advocates for this very important segment of the population that's going to be a lot of people in our cities now and certainly in the future, and to make these cities truly smart. I think that both the nonprofit sector and the government sector can play a significant role to roll out some of these transport services, so that we can start serving all people, all residents in our cities, instead of a segment.
Andrew, you're the one between the rock and the hard place here. What's your take on government participation, and if it makes a big difference? Like, is it a necessary thing?
Yes, absolutely. It's governments and community leaders, developers all need to play a big role and to help address accessibility issues. And I think, Joel, you mentioned a key point earlier. When you make infrastructure, transit access more accessible, it's not for just a small group of people who need it the most. It is for everybody. I have 2 young kids myself. My father was in a wheelchair the last few years of his life. So from my personal experiences, I see some of the barriers that we all face. And, over time, we're all slowly getting older, and our mobility will reduce over time, hopefully not for a while. But when we're making something more accessible, we're also making it better for ourselves. And just sometimes it's just a small design change. Sometimes it could be improved lighting or reducing some type of street furniture, putting it in a different place to improve maneuverability, or wider entrances, or taking out a door, or having a heated area that makes a waiting area a lot more comfortable, so people don't have to travel out of their way, to avoid some of the weather conditions. So there's a lot of examples that we've learned along the way, and I'm sure there's a lot more we can still do. And I'm always looking forward to what we can do next to help make our cities' transit systems more accessible, especially with fuel prices on the rise. There's a larger demand for people to explore alternatives, and we hope we can be there to serve as many people as possible.
So as we're ticking down to the final minutes, my last question to all of you is, in a word or a sentence, what, from your perspective, is the biggest obstacle right now to really scaling and, in a very meaningful, widespread way, rolling out on-demand transit? Jason, do you want to kick us off?
I think In a sentence, that's kind of difficult to say, but I think what's stopping us right now, I don't think there's anything that should be able to stop us with technological innovations. We're starting to see it out in the real world. And I think we can expand these sorts of demand responsive transport services that we've kind of kicked off here in Korea, and expand these sorts of programs in other parts of the world as well. And we're certainly talking with different partners for them. I think we just need to open our mind and kind of imagine the future of our cities is going to be drastically different, but also a lot more inclusive and accessible than they have been traditionally. So as long as we kind of open our mind and look to new alternatives rather than trying to kind of change the existing infrastructure into something that can serve everybody, I think that would be a great way to go.
Perfect. Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, just to continue to reach out to your customers, explore and find out what their needs are, what their key destinations. Having a relatively large on-demand service right now, we're constantly monitoring what's working well. Areas where the service isn't picking up a lot of ridership, we're able to redistribute those resources and serve busier areas or areas where there is a need. And then some areas where on-demand service is picking up a lot of customers and we need additional vehicles, that could be an opportunity to upgrade to a bigger bus and now free up these resources to serve new markets. So it's constantly being adaptive, receptive to the market and customer needs.
Great. And Igor?
Yeah, I think I would say similar to what's already been covered, attitudes and behaviors. I think that one of the biggest challenges that I see when I'm in meetings with folks and conversations is the technology is there, the research is there, and it's just sort of convincing people that we can do things differently and they don't need to be the way that it's always been done. And I think that's the hardest thing. And so I think that's sort of the biggest challenge, to convince people that there are other ways to do it. And yeah, to all sort of collaborate together to get to that point where we could all participate.
Great. And last word to you, Joel.
Thanks. I would just say, as we continue to have dialogue around the issue of accessibility, I think we do need to better understand, from a holistic viewpoint, what does city life look like for someone with a disability? Where do people with disabilities tend to choose to live? In many cases, they don't choose. For example, I lived at Yonge and Eglinton, a part of Toronto that offered many accessible services, but it also offered an accessible subway station. So I would be very interested to see how on-demand transit might actually redeploy people with disabilities to different parts of the city. And I think that's a really exciting thing, especially as housing affordability, continues to be a huge issue, not just for people with disabilities, but everyone. So I'm really excited to continue these discussions, but also make sure that technologies like the one that AutoCrypt is developing really do make a difference in the lives of people with disabilities.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was brilliant and really interesting. And I'm going to pass back to Nino now to wrap it up for us.
Thanks very much, Emma, for moderating and for the handover, and an enormous thanks to Joel, Igor, Andrew, and Jason for sharing their expertise and their experience, more especially, and to everybody in the audience as well for attending. That was a terrific discussion. And a big thank you once again to AutoCrypt for sponsoring this discussion. To learn more about AutoCrypt, visit their website or contact AutoCrypt's team. AutoCrypt's offerings are paving the way for optimized, comprehensive automotive and mobility cybersecurity. And I'd like to invite you next week, if you haven't already done so, to register for our webinar on building a resilient EV supply chain. And you can, if you go to our website, you can see the article recently posted on there with a link to the registration page for that event. So thanks again to everybody for joining us, and thanks for a great discussion today, and see you next week.